So, good morning, everybody. Okay. 다들이 어떻게 지식 서로 협치 직순이 등에를 쳐서 난 로니도 주제 권리야 준비 담바 샤제 개고 샤제 생게 아니 담바 데이터 정보 루주날 세대야래 다 참에 네 전화도 주서 주지 다 뒤시 그도 중모죠 밑에부터 더 연구하는 마도 신 되게다 기부터 뭐 개발시 중어도 상말로 하게 영자 차대하래 다들 좀 되는데 아니 구스 대가라는 살도 상 개발해 아니 이 초그 주고 나발로 전부 마도 아니 구스 개발 망병원에 상 개발 지레스 다 들어야 아니 데이터 데 발릭 다숑 년도 대배 숑기다 영자 전에 소윤도 전에 좀 된데 아니 도시된 있네야 뭐 벌써 상 맞게 팔라 아니 소수교체 되네 아니 서로 뒤뒤 공을 냐버 샤스네 아니 잘람네 송어지기 아니 밀로람 바tur 발래야 아니 냠샤 튠질 디리 아니 도보몬도 주니 아니 상제바 도스는 송이야래 다 참봉고도 규라마 근데 이제 잡아주니 손이 간단한 포 송수수도 담았은 되게 더네 아니 디스 삼월로 즉 상제에 단 잡아려야 샤브는 게 야래 가서 쉬어야게 모니고 아니 다번인데 다인 터도 대 드르르베 냠샤래 요 메신도 아니 주베로가 나서다 샤대하지 드르인데 아니 지금 겨우 뭐 겨우네 송지기 잡아지도 사발로 상지기 잡아체
So till then, sorry, there was some technical issue here. So among the 12 deeds, 12 noble deeds, so from the first to the 9, it's counted as the Bodhisattva's deed, and the last 3 as the enlightened one's deed. So this is accordingly coming from the Maitreya's text. So if we think in generally also, a common and ordinary person, of course, we speak about the 3 countless eons, accumulations, and so on. But it is so difficult to conceive that even in just one lifetime, that someone will be able to completely attain the enlightenment, completing all the realizations and spiritual grounds and so on. And also, when we categorize the 3 accumulations, the accumulations for 3 eons, the first accumulation is said to be completed in the first 2 parts, the path of accumulation and the preliminary part. Then the next at the path of seeing, and the 7 spiritual grounds after that, from the first level to the 7th. Then the last 3 also completes the final accumulations. So in order to say that, so there is generally a question arises whether there is the enlightenment or not, is the state of Buddhahood or not. And we also speak about the 3 liberation states from the Charvaka, Pradika Buddha, and the Bodhisattvas. So all these the states of liberations are actually similar, apart from the difference in their accumulations, the period and the duration of their accumulations. And this is very evidently presented by Nagarjuna in one of his texts. So for all these liberations, if there is not much difference at the initial, the causal state in terms of the practicing the paths, so then if there is not much difference at the causal state, then at the resultant state, it is very difficult to have a huge difference in the state of the liberations. So this is stated by Nagarjuna. And I feel that this is a very valid reason. And whether we call the Sanskrit traditions or those, especially the Mahayana tradition, so those explanations coming from the Mahayana traditions seems to be more reasonable. So whatever the case may be, so the Lord Buddha attained enlightenment as we discussed yesterday. And he turned the first Dharma wheel, the Four Noble Truths, and this is common and it is already listed in the history. But the second, the turning of the wheel of Dharma, the Prajnaparamita Sutra, the perfection of wisdom teaching, is not accounted in the history. So therefore, it is a dispute whether it is the actual teaching of the Buddha or not. And therefore, we can find many instances in the text of the Maitreya and also by Nagarjuna where they prove with many valid reasons that the Mahayana teaching is actual the teachings of Buddha. And also the Bhavaviveka has also placed the same importance in proving the Mahayana teachings as the Buddha's teaching in his Blazing of Reasons and other texts. And so we have seen many great Indian scholars have worked very hard to prove, to authenticate the Mahayana teachings as the Buddha's teachings. And even today's world, even today, we can find many people who do not consider the Mahayana teachings as the actual teaching of Buddha. But as for the Four Noble Truths, the teaching on Four Noble Truths, it is a common acceptance among all of us. And I think this is a fact because the perfection of wisdom teaching is given to the Volchurpik, and even from the Heart Sutra that we usually recite. And within the text, it reads that the Avalokiteshvara in the certain meditative absorption in the meditation state, and the surrounding the Shariputra and other disciples. So the whole text of Heart Sutra seems to be a conversation between Shariputra and Avalokiteshvara, Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. And also the other disciples at that time also are able to see the Avalokiteshvara in the enlightened and the Bodhisattva form, in the God's form. So those students or disciples who may not have the enough ripening of their mental continuum, or who may not be fortunate enough to see them in the enlightened form, they may not be able to hear the teachings. And we can also find in the 800,000 verses the sutra where it speaks about the conversation between many other Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. So this is very evident that this kind of teachings are being primarily taught to a certain limit of students whose mental continuums are very ripened and are able to receive those teachings. But then there is other sutras such as the Sangye Nirmanchaya Sutra, the Sutra unraveling Buddha's teaching, which is taught at Vaishali. And even in that sutra, the Sangye Nirmanchaya Sutra, it also speaks about the three turning of the wheel of the Dharma. And within the disciples, it also speaks about the difference in their their mental capacity, their mental intelligence, and so on. For example, and as we discussed yesterday, in the second, the turning wheel of the Dharma. So in the Sangha Sutra, the second turning of the wheel is being given the term as the turning of the wheel on the absence of the inherent existence of the phenomena. So this is the title given for the second turning of the wheel of the Dharma, while the third turning of the wheel is given as the complete and the extensive and the finalized the turning of the wheel, where it is where the details of the Buddha's teachings were distinguished in very right order. So therefore, even though the turning of the wheel of the Dharma is actually a definitive sutra, which also tells about which presents the emptiness and so on, but it's not something that can be literally accepted, and so it has to be interpreted further. So the great Nalanda scholars, after that, a few of them consider the Sangha Nirmancha Sutra as the main sutra, and based on that, they speaks about the negating the external existence of an external phenomena other than the mind, and there are also instances of the citations and the sources coming from different sutra that the three realms are merely a conceptions or the perception of a mind. So therefore, the terminology, the mind only or the Chitta mantra came into being. And so after that, the tradition of the mind only school came into being. So the perfection of the wisdom sutras, the main content, and the followers who accepted the meaning of the sutras came to be known as the Madhyamika traditions. So here again we have to make a distinction that all the phenomena, so when we speak about Madhyamika, so it doesn't really mean that they accept the non-existence of all the phenomena. So rather, they accept all the things are not being existent in inherently way. So after that, these traditions of Madhyamika philosophical systems came into being. So there is a great difference between this philosophical system. And if we really have to draw the very detailed distinction between these traditions, then as I used to speak about the 17 Nalanda Pandits, and in Tibet we have traditions of counting about the 6 ornaments and 2 supreme masters. So maybe this came into being, I'm not so sure, but from the great learning centers like Sangpo in Tibet. So maybe the term was coined at that time. So in these 6 ornaments and the 2 supreme masters, so Nagarjuna, the Baba Viveka is also not included. The Chandakriti is also not counted in that. And Buddhapalita is also not counted among those 8 scholars. But the main text that we study for the Madhyamika philosophical systems, who are the Chandakriti and so on, and also for Tibet in the 8th century, the Shantarakshita is one of the greatest scholars that came to Tibet, and his student Kamalashila. So therefore, I thought and I felt that all of these great scholars need to be counted together in a common group. So therefore, I invented these 17 Nalanda Pandits, the counted. And I've also written a supplication to these masters. And the texts composed by these masters are the real textbook that we have to study. So if we study these texts, we can get to know the very subtle differences among the different philosophical systems in Buddhism pertaining to the foundational path and also the five paths and the resultant state and so on. But the most important difference among all the philosophical systems are pertaining to their view, the profound view, and all this need to be understood by studying the great texts written by these texts. And if we have some certain understanding about the lower philosophical systems, their presentations and so on, then it will help a lot for us to gain a further understanding and much more clearer understanding in the higher philosophical systems. And we can compare between these philosophical systems and what are the differences and so on. And not only that, in one of the texts from the sixth analytical corpus, it speaks about the 16 different reasons used to abolish the object of negation. And you can also find from 60 stanzas where all the views of the non-Buddhist were listed one by one and did a great research behind those views. And we can also find the similar accounts in the Bhavaviveka's The Essence of the Middle Way Philosophy, where he has listed all the non-Buddhist views in a very detailed manner. So this is a kind of a very comparative study that we can put on our table all these different views and assertions together so that we will come to know the very subtle differences among those philosophical views. So this is the main reason why the Lord Buddha turned the wheel for 3 times. And the great Nalenta masters have studied these 3 turning of the wheel very seriously, and they have written many commentaries for this text. And for the first, the turning of the wheel, which is the Four Noble Truths, the teaching on the Four Noble Truths, it is accepted by Pali traditions and also all other traditions. And this is the foundation of all the Buddha's teaching. And from the Four Noble Truths, we need to understand especially the truth of cessation. And the third truth, which is the truth of cessation, is very explicitly explained in the second turning of the wheel. And for the third turning of the wheel, there are certain different illustrations, certain different examples for the text. And there is one text by the Maitreya, which is the unsurpassed mental continuum by the Lord Maitreya. It is also counted as one of the third turning of the wheel. And this is pertaining to the fourth noble truth, which is the path to cessations. And this is very clearly presented in the unsurpassed mental continuum by Maitreya. And in this text, the nature of the mind, which is the Buddha nature, has been explained by 9 different reasons and 9 different illustrations. And also the special features coming from the Tantra. So the profound view system, the profound view presentation that is coming from the second turning of the wheel is common to both, but the Buddha nature or the specific presentation with respect to the mental continuum is something very unique, something quite unique to the Tantra, something unique to the third turning of the wheel. And we can also find that from the different the classes of the Tantra, in some instances the Buddha has taught these different Tantra teachings as being in the form of a bhikshu and in other way in the form of a god and goddess. Sorry. So the third turning of the wheel actually seems to be a platform or a foundation for teaching the Tantra. So therefore, the Lord Buddha has also, by understanding the different mental dispositions of the student, also gave the different teachings. And what I wanted to tell you today is during the first turning of the wheel, so Lord Buddha, before that, attained enlightenment, and he says that I have attained this enlightenment and also the very subtle teaching, so that if I give this teaching to anyone, then there is no one who can receive and understood these teachings. So these teachings speaks about generally the four qualities of very subtle and pacify, and also free of conceptual elaborations, and so on. So this, and also the uncompounded factors. So these are the qualities of his teaching. So ultimately, the clear nature or the clear light that he refers to here for his teachings can be understood from the Tantra. And here, when we speak about the uncompounded factor, it doesn't not really means about. It doesn't really means about just not being a permanent phenomena, but rather it should be understood from the perspective of the subtle nature of the mind, that it has not been compounded by the factors, by the gross mind. So therefore, we can find in the highest Yoga Tantra teachings that the clear light nature of the mind is uncompounded factor. So therefore, Lord Buddha says that these subtle teachings, so if I teach to anyone, then there is no one who will understood this. And the main reason is that at that time in India, so the notion of the existence of Atma, the self, is widely accepted, and so therefore, if Lord Buddha preach about the teachings on selflessness, then there will not be anyone who could take those teachings. So therefore, he stayed retreat for 49 days without giving any teaching. So then after that, the Buddha, the gods and the goddess and all requested him to turn the wheel of the Dharma. And also due to the repeated requests coming from his 5 main disciples. So it seems that the 5 chief disciples, they used to be his main disciples even before he became Buddha. Even during the time of the 6 years very rigorous retreat, and after that, when Lord Buddha took to eating, and so then they says that they came to mutual agreement that they will, even though they have a good relation and respect for the Lord Buddha, but later, so due to Lord Buddha's behavior, so they try to revolt against him, and they say that we will never stand up when Lord Buddha comes. So then when Gautama, the Lord Buddha came nearer and nearer, who is now in the form of the emanation body with all those spiritual features. So automatically they end up standing. So even without having any discussion among themselves, so they all end up standing and bowing to Lord Buddha. And then so in Varanasi, the 5 chief disciples from the Kunshi Gaudinaya and so on. So Lord Buddha gave the first teaching about how to wear the monk's robe, and started the first teaching on Four Noble Truths. And we can find in the direct discourse of the Buddha about the Four Noble Truths, the teaching on the Four Noble Truths. And I think it is a bit more extensive in the Pali tradition on the teachings of the Four Noble Truths. So when Lord Buddha gives the teaching on the Four Noble Truths, there are three different ways of the teaching. So generally we say that the teaching on the Four Noble Truths from its own entity, then the teaching on the Four Noble Truths pertaining to its actions and its result. So when the teaching starts in this way, that this is the truth of suffering, and this is the truth of the cause or origin of suffering. So this speaks about the teaching. This speaks about presents the Four Noble Truths from its own entity or from its own nature. And this summarizes the general notion that as being sentient beings, so everyone seems to have a kind of emotions and a feeling. So unless you are in a deep meditative absorption, so we are all same in the nature of not willing to undergo suffering and wish to have happiness. And the permanent happiness also need to be achieved through many efforts. So when the Lord Buddha presents that this is the truth of suffering, and the second, the origin of the suffering, he speaks about the causes pertaining to the suffering. And the third one, when he say this is the truth of cessation, he meant about by eliminating the origin or the causes of the suffering, then one will attain the cessation. And here the cessation or the moksha is something that we attain by making a lot of effort. And the term, the moksha or the cessation itself also has its own connotation of the verb, the noun, and the agent, where it tries to block the negative emotions from coming up. I also do not know about the Sanskrit terminology for the truth of cessation. And the Sanskrit term for the nirodha, there is also. So if someone is very familiar with the literature, the grammatical literature of the five sciences, then it has a meaning of not being ignorant over something. I also took this class on the main literature from among the five senses from Ling Rinpoche, and I've also studied the Tadukalapa, one of the main grammatical texts, common to both Buddhists and non-Buddhists. So I've forgotten it now. So whatever the case, so the third noble of truth is the truth of cessation, and this is an object of attainment. And the fourth one is the path to the truth of cessation, is the means to achieve the third truth of cessation. So this is speaking from the nature of the Four Noble Truths. So then we have to put this into our own practice. Then the Lord Buddha says that we have to understand, we have to know the suffering, then abandon the origin of suffering, then attain the cessation, and to practice the path. So first we need to understand what is suffering. Again, the suffering is also of three kinds: the suffering upon suffering, and the suffering condition to change, subject to change, and the pervasive suffering. And one of the Tibetan scholars have said that, so in order to understand the different suffering nature of the samsara, there are three different ways to understand that. To understand the general emotions, which are by nature the suffering, we do not need to make any effort, because even the animals have those intention to free themselves from the suffering. So the next level of suffering, which is suffering subject to change, so even which are at this moment the materialistic pleasure and so on, which are at this moment a kind of a pleasure thing, which we always work hard to attain it, but ultimately they are subject to change into suffering the very next moment. And so we are actually mistaken by those materialistic pleasure, that when it at those very moment it gives us a sense of a bit pleasure things. So therefore we feel that it is a permanent pleasure or a happiness. But if it is a really profound pleasure, then however for the long period we experience that, it should continue to give us pleasure, feeling and so on, but that is not the case. So during those times when Lord Buddha says know or understand the suffering, it is not just the second level of suffering, which is the suffering subject to change. So such kind of the suffering which are actually by happiness. So even many of the non-Buddhist practitioners also have the wish to free themselves from this second level of suffering. If we speak from the fourth concentration level, so in the fourth concentration level of the of the form realms, so they only have the neutral emotions, the neutral feelings. So since they do not have the feeling pertaining to the pleasant feeling or the unpleasant feeling, so therefore even the non-Buddhist yogis, they have the wish to free themselves from the second level of the suffering. So therefore, when Lord Buddha says that understand the suffering, he meant for the third level of the suffering, which is the pervasive suffering, which is by nature our own human body. So then what is the pervasive suffering? So the pervasive suffering is being caused, is something that is being caused by the afflicted emotions and the karma. So the features of this cause is by the karma and afflicted emotions, and whatever any kind of suffering that is being caused by the afflicted emotion and the karma is the pervasive suffering. Even for us humans, of course, we have set up many hospitals, we take medicines, and we do a lot of hygienic things, mainly to avert the suffering of suffering. So therefore, we also have the wish to liberate or free ourselves from the first level of suffering. And for the second level of suffering, even as we discussed before, from the full concentration level of the form realms, we can find that there are many even non-Buddhist yogis, the practitioners, who have achieved some realizations based on their meditative concentrations, and they work hard to free themselves from the emotions, the pleasant and unpleasant feelings, and attain the fourth level of concentration, which only consists of the neutral feeling. So having said that, so once we realize that the suffering to be understood here is the pervasive suffering. So then what is the nature of this suffering? How does it arrive? So then Lord Buddha teaches us about the second truth, which is the origin of the suffering. And here the origin of the suffering is actually the karma and the afflicted emotions. And also among these two, the afflicted emotion is the prime ones. And as we discussed yesterday, all the other afflicted emotions, ultimately they're all rooted into in the ignorance. So since we do not wish to undergo suffering, so we should be able to eliminate or work hard to free us from the origin of the suffering. So once we are free of the origin of the suffering, once we are free of the suffering, then we attain the third truth, which is the truth of cessation. So Lord Buddha says for the third time, attain the moksha or the truth of cessation. So then if we have to attain the moksha or the truth of cessation, then what are the means to attain that? Then Lord Buddha teach the fourth noble truth, which is that attain or practice the path to attain the cessation. So this is about the teaching of the Four Noble Truths from its action, or how to implement in one's way, one's daily life. So if after all this, what are the results that we can achieve from being practice and all this thing? Then the Buddha says that even though we eliminate the suffering, but the suffering cannot be eliminated forever, and so on. So the main the definition of this word is that once you have free your suffering, once you understand the suffering, then there will be a stage where you no longer will be able to eliminate the suffering once again. And also for the origin of the suffering. So first, after you have eliminated the ignorance, for once, then you do not need to so once you have eliminated the origin of the suffering, which is ignorance, then you do not need to do it for a second time, because you have permanently done it, so you do not have to do it again. So at this moment, we are aspiring to attain the truth of cessation, but once you have attained the truth of cessation, then you do not need to work hard again to attain the cessation, because once you attain it, you attain it permanently. And once you attain the path and also the cessations, then there is no other cessations of the path that you need to attain again. So this is the third teaching on the Four Noble Truths pertaining to its resultant state. So we can find different variations in terms of the extensive teaching, but this is quite common to all other teachings. So this is about the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths, it's the four features, and totally it's 16 features for the Four Noble Truths. The first, for the truth of suffering, there are four features of the impermanence and the nature of suffering, and so on. So the truth has the four features attributed to that, and these four aspects are very important. So when you contemplate on the suffering, so we need to understand its features about the impermanence, the suffering, the emptiness, and the selflessness, and so on. And also when you contemplate on the four seals, this is also the summary of all the philosophical systems of the Buddhist teaching. So from the philosophical point of view, to be a Buddhist, one need to accept the great seals, that all the phenomena are impermanent, and so on. But then there is a certain level of the Vaibhashika schools which do not accept the selflessness as presented, because it is beyond their imagination. So they accept a kind of a self which cannot be defined. So we normally say that from the philosophical point of view, so from the view point of view, they are not included as Buddhists. But from the behavior or the practice point of view, so they can be counted as a Buddhist. So this is pertaining to the four aspects of the truth of suffering. So then the first aspect or the quality, which is impermanence, and the school, the Vaibhashika school, understood even the impermanence, the quality is very gross and the coarse level. And it also speaks about the four different characteristics. First, to be first to be developed, then to stay, and to become old, and to pass away or to degenerate. And it speaks about first for a phenomena to exist. Then there is second few moments where it stays in the same way, and ultimately it changes to another form. And of course, if you think from the very gross level, so this is very practical. All the materialistic, the affluences that we all seek to have are something, so they will cease to exist in one time. So even the very body of ourselves will cease to exist at time. So all the objects that we wish to attain will ultimately come to cease to exist. So this is pertaining to the teachings on the impermanence according to Vaibhashika school. So understanding first the very gross level of impermanence, then we need to draw our attention or move our practice to the suffering nature, as it is being presented by the Dhammakriti in the Pramana text, that from the understanding of the impermanence, one should be able to move one's focus to the second aspect, which is the suffering nature. Then moving to the next philosophical school, which is the Sutranta school. So this speaks about the very momentary nature of impermanence. And so this speaks about a very subtle nature of the impermanence level, that all the phenomena exist. So the very moment they exist, so they are by nature momentarily changing, by nature to be changed into another form. So in terms of the form, things with the physics, even from the very subtle, the atoms and the neurons, and they are in the form of the wavelengths, which tend to change momentarily, so always in the nature of change. So there is not even a single moment where they stay. And I think we can also check those things through the microscope, and I've also seen it a few times. And also the reason why these things are so is, as we discussed before, pertaining to our own life and for our own physical body. So the nature of our body also start changing from a few years, from year 1 to 2. So if we have to summarize, the changes that happen in 1 year has to happen in the 12 months, and so it has to happen in the 1 month. So the changes that happens in 1 month has to happen in 1 week, and for the changes that happen in 1 week has to happen in 1 day, and similarly for 1 hour, 1 minute, and 1 second. So ultimately, momentarily. So if you look from the very subtle particle, and the moment, so it keeps on changing by every moment. And even when they grow, there's those small particles, so they grow from very momentarily, or by moment, or from very small portion they become a huge heap. Similarly, when they disintegrate from a heap to a very small particle, and so on. But then there's a certain scholars in the Vaibhashika school which says that the factor for the disintegration of a phenomena is being caused by another factor that comes after it. But all the other schools, from the Sutranta to Mind Only and the Madhyamika school, do not accept that. And as of now, when we speak about the 4 aspects of the truth of suffering, we speak about those aspects pertaining to our own physical body, not of the uncontaminated qualities of birth and cessations and so on. So the nature, the reason why the things changes momentarily, because it is done by a cause. So what is the cause here? The cause here is the ignorance. So all the compounded phenomena are by nature dependent phenomena, because they come under the influence of the ignorance. So overall, since we counted, the ignorance is one of the afflicted emotions. So even though we consider our physical body as very precious, but ultimately our physical body is a slave of the ignorance. So ignorance control our whole body. So this line coming from Dhammakriti, that from the impermanence need to understand the suffering nature, and from suffering nature to the selflessness. So the later one is a bit more difficult to understand. And I think that we need to understood these presentations pertaining to from the second truth. And some of the schools, they assert that the aggregates or the physical body is something that changes momentarily, but the self seems to be a steady or an eternal one. So therefore, it is very difficult to identify how to say that someone is older or younger. So we cannot determine the age or the seniority of a person from itself, but rather from its physical things. And we also have the same feeling that the present body of yourself, we do not think that we have the same physical body when we are born. At the time of our birth, we do not have the same body. So we tend to have a feeling that the physical body that we have now is not the same as before, when we are as a young child. But we tend to have the same feeling for the self as being the same as once we were young and old now. So in this way, if we have to contemplate that there is not a self which is different from, or which is not dependent upon the philosophical systems, then also it's a bit complicated. So from the gross level of the understanding of the selflessness, first we have to understand the selflessness from the point of being not eternal and non-unitary and independent and so on. So the self has to be always understood from the perspective or with dependence upon the self. So without being dependent, without depending upon the aggregate, so there may not be able to understand a self. So the selflessness, the understanding of a selflessness pertaining to the dependence upon its aggregates, which is understood by all the lower philosophical systems, is again quite what should I say, a gross understanding of selflessness pertaining to the highest Madhyamika school. So then, according to Madhyamika Prasangika school, the selflessness is pertaining about self as not being intrinsically existent, absence of intrinsic nature. So this is much more subtle compared to the previous ones. Now, for the second truth of the origin of suffering, it speaks about the cause and the conditions. And Arya Asanga has spoken about the three conditions, about the conditions of impermanence, the conditions of power, and the conditions similar to the cause. And I used to think a lot about these three conditions with the explanations coming about, the explanations pertaining to the truth of origin. So the first condition here is about that all the causes have not been designed by a supernatural power. So for us also, even our daily life, so everything that happens need to have a cause. So if it doesn't depend on a cause, then those phenomena need to exist eternally, or they have to be always present, or they can never be present. So since all the phenomena have their own causes, so most of the traditions, since they accept the creator, so they accept that all the causes here that we are describing is something being designed by a supernatural power, so which is here, it can be taken in the form of a god or the creator. So who has designed, the creator has a design all the existence in this world. So here, when we say that the first condition, which speaks that all the things are not being designed, not arises by a supernatural design or a power, so then it speaks about the impermanence nature of the phenomena, so which is the second conditions. So the second condition, which is the condition of impermanence, is that since the product is an impermanent phenomena, therefore the cause has to be also impermanent. And the third one is that for the whatever the product may be, so the cause at the causal level, there need to be a certain quality or certain capacity at the causal level to produce that product. So therefore, the third condition comes about the condition possessing the power to produce the product. So such a kind, ultimately, all the phenomena do not arises by eternal cause, and also they are not designed by a supernatural power. And so since their nature of this, so therefore, ultimately, we have to come to the conclusion that ignorance is the main cause here. So after accepting all these three conditions and so on, so we have to come to the conclusion that ignorance is the main cause. And the fourth one, which is the condition, the first, the cause, and the second, very strong force and so on. So the fourth aspect of the second truth, the truth of origin, is the condition. So the condition here speaks about that whatever karma that we have planted, or we have planted before, so for it to ripen, we need another conditions to ripen it. So this is explained. This is with respect to what we meant by the condition here. So from all this, we can understand that the ignorance is a false or a wrong perception. So since it is a wrong perception, so then there need to be another perception, which is the opposite or the antidote of that wrong perception. So by taking the antidote of the ignorance, so one should be able to gradually eliminate the ignorance. So at that level, when we are able to completely eliminate the ignorance, then we attain the third truth, which is the truth of cessation. And this cessation here, again, has not happened eternally without any cause, but this also arises through one's practice of by practicing different paths and meditation. So ultimately we attain the truth of cessation. So therefore this truth of cessation is referred here as pacify and complete peace, and something that we satisfaction. So therefore this is the four aspects of the truth of cessation, which is the first, the cessation, and pacify, and satisfaction. And so here the complete satisfaction means that this is not a temporary a kind of a rest that we normally take, but this is a permanent one. So therefore, it is said the fourth quality comes into being. And the fourth noble truth, which is the path to cessation, is the first the path. The second is the intellect or the cognition. It doesn't mean that merely by being a consciousness is not enough. So here the path is referred to a primordial wisdom that understood the nature of the phenomena. And also, so such a kind of the primordial wisdom may not be able to generate merely by listening to the teaching or by contemplation. So rather, it has to be generated by meditative absorption. So therefore, the third quality or the third aspect come into being. So in this way, if we think about the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, then it will bring some changes to our mind. Then we have the 37 practices of the Bodhisattva. So 37 practices of the enlightenment. A few years ago, I met some professors from Buddhist University in Bangkok, and we have some discussion. And as I said yesterday, we discussed about the Four Noble Truths and the 16 aspects and so on. And so whether is it possible to prove the existence, prove the teaching of the Four Noble Truths and the 16 aspects by reason, or was it that Buddha merely teach this as a source of citations? So they told me that, oh, this is merely philosophical, the scriptural sources depend on scriptural sources, and we do not depend on logical reasoning to prove this. But then we can find in the Sanskrit traditions that in the perfection of wisdom, the teachings and so on, all these aspects are one by one taught very extensively with the proof of different logical reasoning and so on. And in the Middle Way philosophy, of course, which is the main content of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, the teaching on emptiness is very extensively taught, which is very wonderful. And if we think about the first group of the 37 practices, which is the mindfulness, here the mindfulness of the first of the mindfulness of our physical body. So due to as we develop the attachment and the anger, with anger due to the different emotions within pertaining to our physical body. So therefore, the first mindfulness teaching come into being. Then second is about the mindfulness of the consciousness or the mind. And again, the consciousness here is pertaining to the point of reference of the self. So if the mind or the consciousness, which is the point of reference of the self, and if since the self itself doesn't exist, doesn't have its own existence, inherent existence, so therefore the qualification of the self, which is designated upon that mind, cannot have its own existence. So this is the second level of mindfulness. So these teachings are coming from the Prajnapada Perfection of Wisdoms are very wonderful. And the third, mindfulness, the mindfulness on the teachings. And also the next, so the next group, which is about the life of the abandonment, so where we aspire to abandon all the negativities and work hard to foster and enhance the positive qualities and so on. And then there is the 4 miraculous activities. Then ultimately it comes to the eightfold path, which is the profound livelihood, right livelihood, and right mindfulness, right concentration, and right view, and so on. So all these eightfold paths again being comprised of the 3 trainings can be further expanded into the 3 trainings. So these teachings and these presentations are pertaining to the general teachings of Buddha. And the second turning of the will in the perfection of wisdom, so the emptiness is being taught in a very detailed way. So in this text by Shantideva, the guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life, so in order to understand what is the omniscient mind, we need to have an aspiration to attain the omniscient mind. And what are the causes? And causes for that, first we need to have the aspiration to attain the enlightenment. So even that kind of aspirations we can find even in the Sharvakas and the Pratigya Buddhas. So but here our aspiration or intention to attain enlightenment should be the main motivation to benefit other people. And as it is stated in the ornaments of the sutra by Maitreya, that the root of this is the great compassion. So the root of this is actually referring to the Bodhichitta. So in order to attain Bodhichitta, first one need to practice or accumulate, one need to generate the great compassion. And in order to generate the great compassion, so it needs to be attained by practicing the 7-point cause and effect. This is one way. And the second way of developing the great compassion, as it is coming from the Shantideva's text here, and also coming from the Ratnavali, the precious garland by Nagarjuna. The second path is by exchanging the self with other, equalizing and exchanging the self with other. So this text is considered as a supreme text among all other texts in terms of presenting the path of equalizing and exchanging the self and other. Of course, there are a few citations here, but generally, the most of the presentation, the points here, are backed by the reasons, the logical reasons. So having taken the Bodhisattva, Bodhichitta, and then we need to feel a great joy. So 26 verse. So this is the 3rd chapter. Please turn to 3rd chapter, the 26th verse. Please turn to 3rd chapter, the acceptance of the awakening mind. This is the 3rd chapter and verse number 26. Sorry, 16. Yes, 26, sorry. Today my life has borne fruit, well obtained this human existence. I've been born in the family of Buddha, and now am one of the Buddha's sons. And the 27th verse. If we are able to take the Bodhisattva vow every day, on a daily basis, it will be very beneficial. And that we have taken this precious human rebirth, and also we have we have heard the teachings of the Buddha. And as a basis for practice the 6 perfections and the 4 ways of gathering, so taking the Bodhisattva vows is one of the main thing. And whatever the practices that we do, so in order to turn all these activities for the attainment of the ultimate omniscient mind, and also to elimination of the both obscurations pertaining to liberation and the omniscient mind, then we need to practice the Bodhisattva vow. So even the generosity and ethical discipline are actually practiced by the Sharvakas and the Pratigya Buddhas also, but they are not being categorized as the perfection. So the perfection is here referring only to the practices pertaining to the Bodhisattva's vow. And as the Dhammakriti says that with the understanding of both the conventional wisdom understanding conventionalities, and the wisdom understanding the six perfections on the other side. So with these two sides, so one can one can fly over the great ocean of the accumulations and reach the state of enlightenment. And we have one a saying from a great Tibetan master that the two kayas, two enlightened aspects of the Buddha, so these two enlightened aspects of the Buddha cannot be arise by unrelated cause. So these two has to be attained by a path which is combined of both the wisdom and the skillful means. Where the two wings, one wings of the six perfections and the other of the wisdom together. And here on one side, one path can be also understood as the extensive part, which is the merits, accumulation of the merits, and the other side, the profound view, which is the accumulations of the primordial wisdom. So with these two accumulations, one can attain the enlightenment state. So we have the opportunity to practice such a path, and by taking this human rebirth, only it is possible for us to do this practice. Even for the gods and the goddess and the heavenly beings, it is impossible to understand this, especially when it comes to the highest yoga tantra's presentation of the very subtle mind, the clear mind, and so on. So other than a human rebirth, it is impossible to even practice those secret practices. And the great master Nagabodhi has stated in one of his texts that even the bodhisattvas staying in the heavenly abode also wanted to take rebirth in this samsaric world. With the want to take a human rebirth, which is adorned with all the facilities. So since they do not have this human rebirth with all the advantages and the leisures, so they are not able to practice accordingly to the tantra. So only through this human rebirth, one can practice the secret drop, the teachings on the drops, and also the very subtle mind. As the 26th verse reads, "Today my life has borne fruit, well obtained this human existence." And the verse number 28 says that just like a blind man discovering a jewel in a heap of rubbish, so this is true. His Holiness comments that with all these accumulations, due to our past accumulations, we have taken this human rebirth. And from the external, the facilities point of view, so the place where we are born also happen to be have the teachings of the Lord Buddha. And this is very important. So Domtemba, when he was about to pass away, so he was putting his hat on the lap of Potowa, who is his student, and Potowa was crying, and a drop of tear fall on the drum's face, and the drum Domtemba stood up and asked him what happened. And Potowa says that, So till now, you are my Vajra master, so you are my guidance. So whatever the doubts I have, I can come to you, and I have taken all the instructions from you. So now that you are passing away, so I am left with no guidance, no protector. So to whom I should take as my master. So how should I do practice? This is what said by the Bodhisattva. So therefore he said he felt very sad. And Domtamba replied that, so from now onwards, your master is your text and your scripture. So this is wonderful. And the 300 volumes of the Buddha's teaching has to be our real master, our real teacher. And we only study a few texts coming from the commentary discourses. So other than that, we always consider them very precious and put it in our altar and do not really study them. And I used to playfully say that when we do the recitation of the seventh limb, and one of them is to request the Buddha to turn the wheel of Dharma. And when we request Buddha to turn the wheel of Dharma, so Lord Buddha, or even the Nagarjuna, or even the great masters from Tibetan region, so they may say that I have already given you the teachings. I have composed so many texts, the books, and you are not at all reading those books. So I think that they will definitely say this. So by supplicating to these masters, so apart from doing that, we need to study the texts written by those great texts. And we Tibetans are actually very fortunate by the grace of the great Tibetan emperors. Most of the texts, the Buddhist texts from India were translated. So 100 volumes of the direct discourses and 200 commentary discourses were already translated into Tibetan. And also the Pali, many from Pali traditions were already translated. And there is a commentary by the Chinese master Wenzik. So some of those texts were translated from Chinese. Other than that, most of the Buddhist texts that we find in Tibet were translated from Sanskrit in Nalanda. So for us, in order to study anything, we can directly read the Tibetan translation, so we do not need to depend on any other language. Of course, that Buddhism came to China much earlier, and many of the texts were translated into Chinese. And I heard that most of the direct commentary discourses, the 200 volumes, so in Chinese language do not seem to have many of these translations, where in Tibetan we can find all of these translations. So I think that in today's world, if we need to explain or give explanations pertaining to the views of the Nalanda tradition, so Tibetan language is the supreme one. So the 28th verse reads, just like a blind man discovering a jewel in a heap of rubbish, likewise by some coincidence, an awakening mind has been born within me. 29. It is the supreme ambrosia that overcomes the sovereignty of death. So we always, for our longevity of our life, we used to receive longevity empowerments and also depend on ambrosia and so on. But due to the afflicted emotions within us, like anger and attachments, actually destroy the lifespan, destroy our lifespan. So therefore, these attachments, so these poisons need to be eliminated by practicing the Bodhichitta mind. So if you practice Bodhichitta, of course, you will gain a sense of a peace, a kind of a peace in your mind. As your mental peace increase, of course, the afflicted emotions will decrease. So it is the inexhaustible treasure, the third line reads, that eliminates all poverty in the world. And with bodhicitta mind, so if we rejoice and offer and dedicate to all the sentient beings, so with that your accumulations will also increase. So with that, the wealth and all these things will automatically come by itself. Even if you look from the other perspective, the samsara, the suffering pertaining to the lower realms and the cyclic existence, and to eliminate all these sufferings, and also this bodhicitta also give us the ultimate attainment, which is the liberation. And as we discussed before, if you have a very calm mind, of course you will have a better physical health. So the 30th line, the third verse reads that it is the tree that shelters all beings, wandering and tired on the path of the conditioned existence. So at this stage, even though we are bound by the afflicted emotions and the karma, but even at such a very difficult state, if we do some prayer and work towards accumulating our mind towards the bodhicitta, of course there is a possibility for us to gain some inspirations. And as the Nagarjuna has phrased that, has supplicated in his text that may I be the source of all the happiness for all the peoples, may I be the land, may I be the air, and so on. So even at this stage, even we are dependent and under the influence of these afflicted emotions, but we can still work towards other people, work for the other people by generating this great bodhicitta mind, which will make our life very meaningful. And this will also give us. So next is the verse number 31. It is the universal bridge that leads to freedom from unhappy states of birth. And we discussed yesterday, of course, the countless number of the animals that you can see every day, but there is nothing that you can do about it. Apart from shedding a few tears, there is nothing that you can do. But for the human family, of course, there is a lot that we can do for each other. So therefore, we have to work hard to help each other. And the man-made suffering, the human-made suffering in this world, in terms of the corruption, the killing, and also deceiving, and so on. So which will, of course, everyone is the same in the sense that they do not wish to have any suffering. But considering yourself as the most important and neglecting other people's needs and requirements, so one ends up always inflicting harm towards other people. So when we also categorize the sixth realm, so we seems to be fall under the higher rebirths compared to the lower animal realms. But we can see that even though we are in a higher realm as a human rebirth, but in this human existence, in this world, we can see the suffering in the same level as there will be in the hell. So this is very sad. So how do you think? It's very sad. So if world is only filled with such a kind of negative actions by killing and so on, then there is no benefit of taking human rebirth. But no one has become a killer or such things just by being born in this world. But later on, gradually, we tend to create a distinction between you and me, and in this way, all these atrocities come into being. And as we discussed yesterday, through education, through bringing a change in the education system, there is a hope that we can bring a change to the peace of the world. But the current education system is not very equivalent to the present needs. as it is very clearly that if we criticize other people, if we inflict harm on other people, you will be left without any friends and you will end up being very lonely. So this is true. Of course, we can see that the materialistic progress is immense in this world, but as the materialistic progress is going from one level to another, the peace of the mind is decreasing in the same way in this world. So whether it's the education system or the guidance or showing an example, so this is very important here. So the verse number 31, it is the universal bridge that leads to freedom from unhappy states of birth. So with this sense of the bodhicitta, so we have to always strive towards whatever possibility that we can do in our own capacity to help others. So the third line reads, it is the dawning moon of the mind that dispels the torment of disturbing conceptions. So actually, as we discussed, bodhicitta is not the the antidote of the ignorance and other afflicted emotions. But still the bodhicitta has a great courage and the power to decrease the afflicted emotions. So this reads the third and the fourth line of the verse number 31. So when we think in this way, as we grow the self-concern to a higher level, so gradually the afflicted emotions within us will decrease, especially when we meditate on the profound view and emptiness. And the purpose of meditating on the emptiness is for eliminating the afflicted emotions within us. So therefore, meditating on emptiness will help a lot. And if we look from another perspective, the meditation on the wisdom for the understanding of the wisdom. The wisdom realizing emptiness, for it to become the real antidote against the obscuration to omniscient mind, it needs the support of bodhicitta. So only with the help of bodhicitta, one will be able to turn the wisdom realizing emptiness as the direct antidote of the afflicted emotions and the obscuration to omniscient mind. And it is also very clearly that if we have a very settled mind, a very calm mind, then we will be able to have a better health for ourselves. And with the help of bodhicitta, will have us to have a very calm and a very settled mind. So these unrealistic actions and unrealistic approach we're all coming through. We're all driven by these afflicted emotions. So this is not speaking or about whether you accept the next life or not, or whether you accept the karma or not, but this is something that is needed for all the people to have a good heart. So a warm-hearted is something that everybody need to have. And this is a main thing that we can hope for to bring a permanent, lasting peace in the world. So here completes the third chapter. So next is the fourth chapter. It's the conscientiousness. So here, the conscientious is actually meant for a kind of a state where, which is based on a warm-heartedness. And this physical body is again dependent upon the afflicted emotions, and it is also being caused by those afflicted emotions. So therefore, it is called the five aggregates, the aggregates which is driven by the afflicted emotions, and it also become a condition for the emotions, the afflicted emotions within us to rise. So therefore, so the English term biologically, the nature of our physical system is such that biologically it supports the aversion of the afflicted emotions within us. Even if you look at the external conditions are filled with the different sources of distractions and different afflicted emotions. So at such a state, if we do not remain alerted for ourselves and do not stay in a very calm state, then there is always the danger of oneself being under the influence of the afflicted emotion. The verse number 1, having firmly seized the awakening mind in this way, a conqueror's son must never waver, always should be exert himself to never stray from his practice. So no need to read the whole verse. So this speaks about how one have to exert himself or herself from not wavering from one's focus. So the 6th verse, then if I should deceive all beings after having sincerely invited them to the unsuppressible bliss, shall I take a heavy rebirth? So His Holiness comments that one wished to bring all the sentient beings to the state of enlightenment, and I take all the sentient beings as my guests. So having accepted that, so in order to satisfy all these sentient beings, we have to be very practical. Otherwise, it's just a hypocrisy. You're just saying beautiful words from your mouth. Then it is also a lie. And you have also taken the Bodhisattva vow. And if you do not put it into practice, then it is a lie. So if sometimes you tell a lie before a friend or someone, then if that is considered a bad practice, then of course you have, by taking the Bodhisattva vow and not practicing it, is telling a lie before all the Buddhas and Bodhisattva. Therefore, it is very unfortunate. So next is about the defeats and the ethical setbacks pertaining to the Bodhisattva vows. And even though there are many ethical setbacks here, but the verse is letting go of your aspirational mind, that you will not be able to vote for the other sentient beings. So then, of that very moment, you will lose your bodhicitta. So there is not necessary to have the other afflicted emotions with that. So even though there are many other ethical setbacks pertaining to the Bodhisattva vows, but the worst one is this. So verse number 8 reads, this for a Bodhisattva is the heaviest of downfalls, for should it ever happen, the welfare of all will be weakened. So 12th verse. Therefore, just as I have promised, shall I respectfully accord my actions. So we need to feel very encouraged for oneself. And the verse reads, if from now on I make no effort, I shall descend from lower to lower states. And the verse number 13 reads, although for the benefit of every creature, countless Buddhas have passed by, yet I was not an object of their care because of my own mistakes. The verse number 14, and if I continue to act like this, again and again shall I undergo. And I think it's the Mayan text. We speaks about the 1,000 Buddhas. In one of the Pali texts, so how many Buddhas? Was it 25? I think it was 25. So this is something that we have to think about it, and many of you knows. And this is the presentation coming from Abhidhamma Kosha, that the world is a flat and with four sides, and center with the Mount Meru is something which is common, popularly known at that time, but this is not a reality. And I met one of the non-Buddhist scholar before that, and he told me that one of the Buddhist scholars have stated that the earth is the flat surface. But now we can clearly see that the earth is oval shape and it's not flat. So as we discussed yesterday, that even for those sutras which present the teachings on the emptiness, still the Buddha has given us the liberty to categorize them into definitive and non-definitive. Then of course, why can't we give another explanation for the presentation with respect to the shape of the world? And also, when does this world that came into being, the earth? And from the Abhidhamma Kosha, it speaks about the countless number of the years before the formation of this. But and again, I think this is very difficult. According to scientific, the sun, till the sun, I think it's about 5 million years since the earth came into being, and 5 billion since the earth came into being, and about 1 billion years ago the creatures and the living beings started to arrive on this world. And Yandar Rinpoche told me a few days that in one of the sutras, the world is actually presented as a round shape. In one of the sutra, the Kunsek, and we can also find in one of the other texts that some worlds are flat and some worlds are oval and so on. And in a few years back, when I was in Australia, I was invited for lunch by the governor. And there is a pasture in the park. I went inside. And I met a television crew who asked me, so there's some animals like dinosaurs which exist about many millions of years ago. Then he asked me whether you believe in that or not. Then I was surprised, taken aback, because these things can be proved. We can see the bones and everything. And I asked my friends that there was a very strange question. And then I was told that some of the Christian faith is that the world was created only 5,000 years ago. So the millions of years history is difficult to believe. So therefore, even for a Buddhist, we speak about the human lifespan that exists millions of countless number of years before is also very different. Then also the decrease and the increase of the lifespan for the 18 different variations are also very difficult to accept. And also the past Buddhas, and some of them said to be in the 80,000, then the 40,000, the 20,000 years of lifespan, as it is listed in the text. This is all something that we have to do some experiment, do some research. We also built Maitreya's statue and prayer that we be born during the Lord Maitreya's time. Then we speak that the human lifespan, the current, will go down till the 10 years, where the 10 years will be the maximum lifespan for a human. Then it will increase till the 10,000. Then I have once an account with Tuchu Rinpoche. He says that the Maitreya building Maitreya statue is wonderful, but if you build a Lord Shakyamuni statue, this will be more beneficial because Buddha Shakyamuni is the present Buddha. So future, if you think about the future, it is wonderful, but it's even better to practice something which is relevant at the moment. The teachings coming from the Nagarjuna and the other great masters. So this is more relevant. Even during the Lord Maitreya's time, there won't be teachings like this. Even the teaching of the Tantra will not be present during the Maitreya's time, as we normally say that the teachings of the Maitreya is even more scarce than the Buddhists themselves. I think this is not very important. We normally speak about the Buddha, and we just also have a reference from the Jainism about 25 different emanations. So I think this is something that we all have to do some research. So where are we now? So the 15th verse, if the arising of a Tathagata, faith, the attainment of a human body, and my being free to cultivate virtues are scarce, when will they be born again? Sorry. The 16th verse reads, although today I am healthy, well-nourished and unafflicted, life is momentary and deceptive. The body is like an object on loan for but a minute. We have also seen the benefits of doing some positive thing. And someone who has already seen this, the positive, then if they do not engage in the virtuous activities, then they will end up in the most severe the sufferings. The verse number 17 reads, and with behavior such as this, I shall not win a human body again, and if this human form is not attained, there will be solely evil and no virtue. So if you contemplate in these verses, the presentations coming from these verses, then it will summarize the importance of this human rebirth. So the verse number 22 reads, but having experienced merely that, I shall still not be liberated, for while it is being experienced, other evil will be extensively produced. So from the verse number 24 onwards, it presents the suffering pertaining to the hell realms. So then from the next verse onwards, it speaks about all the negative actions like deceiving other, killing other, and all these negative actions arises from afflicted emotions. So therefore, we have to contemplate and think about the negativities of afflicted emotions. So generally we say that first we have to abolish those non-virtuous activities. But here the root of the ignorance is here the grasping of the true existence. So first we have to work hard to abolish and abandon our perception of the self as an eternal. So the 26th lines reads that, the 28th line reads that although enemies such as hatred and craving have neither any arms or legs, and are neither courageous nor wise, how have I been used like a slave by them? So normally when we characterize an enemy, we usually have an impression of someone with a huge body and big arms and so on. But the title of the afflicted emotion, as we also have that definition coming from the lower verses, The Sanskrit term for the afflicted emotion is the kalesha. And even though the Tibetan term is same for both of these verses, but the Sanskrit term is different here. And this has to be abolished by the eye of wisdom. So the reason why it is very subtle, the reason why it is not, it is very simple, is that it can be completely eradicated by the wisdom. And again, the afflicted emotion is not backed by any valid reasons. There is no background for these afflicted emotions, whereas the compassion and the love, so they are backed with valid reasons. So if you practice further, so the nature of their those minds, those qualities will progress further until it reach the enlightenment. So the verse number 28. The 29, for while they dwell within mind, so the external enemy will reside in the external way in front of you or at your backside or somewhere else. And we can see in the traditional way that most of the landlords and the kings, they build their bungalows and the houses on the top of the mountains and the hills so as to be safeguard themselves from the enemy. But nowadays we have to build them underground or something to save oneself from the nuclear attacks and so on. But so these enemies are actually residing outside in external, so they harm us from the outside, but the afflicted emotion, which is the real enemy, resides within our mind, resides within us and bring harm to us. At their pleasure, they cause me harm. And when we say at their pleasure means the afflicted emotion has all the freedom for themselves to harm us because there is no antidote for that. And we consider the afflicted emotions as a very natural emotions. And today, in today's society, if someone is very boasted, or someone is very jealous, or someone is very angry, then some people consider those to be a powerful person. Then if someone is a very simple person, so people look down at that, which is very wrong. So therefore, we consider we have a special preference for the anger and the hatred and so on. Yet I patiently endure them without any anger, but this is an inappropriate and shameful time of patience. This is the line number 3 and 4 of the verse number 29. So the verse number 30, should even all the gods and anti-gods rise up against me as my enemies, they could not lead nor place me in the roaring fires of the deepest hells. His Holiness comments that even all the sentient beings in this world rise against me as enemies, but they do not have the power to cast me into the lower realms. But the very afflicted emotion within myself has the complete power to cast me into the suffering and the lower realms. And the 32 verses reads that all other enemies are incapable of remaining for such a length of time, as can my disturbing conceptions. So the enemy of afflicted emotions are within us from the beginningless time, and those afflicted emotions were not created by the God, and also they do not arise without cause. Then, as we discussed yesterday, that the consciousness, the continuity of the consciousness is beginningless. Similarly, since afflicted emotions are by nature consciousness, so therefore the continuity or the beginning of the afflicted emotions are also beginningless. And again, we have to rely this on the 4 logic reasonings, and the ultimate of them being the logic reasonings of the nature. And as soon as our mind, the general consciousness, starts coming into being, then the afflicted emotions tends to come with it. So this has become a part of our mind. But some people may feel a bit uncomfortable when saying that. So the inner enemy of the afflicted emotions, which become our enemy from the beginningless of time, but the external enemies at the outside, they only become an enemy for a moment at a certain time, but they were never enemy from the beginningless of time. So from a very young childhood, so no one has any enemies, but once as we grow up, then due to the different circumstances, and also since we lack the advices and the guidance about to how to avoid the afflicted emotions and so on. So this whole society and the education system also backed the rise of afflicted emotions within us. So therefore, so the nature of the society is such that it supports the arisal of the afflicted emotions. So in order to change that, we need to adopt a new education system. We can see that with the introduction of today's education system, there has been a tremendous change in the world if you look at the history. Similarly, now we have to also bring a certain change to the present education system so that we can hope for a more peaceful world in future. And as we discussed yesterday, we are working towards it. And the second reason is coming from the verse number 33. If I agreeably honor and entrust myself, and even though it may be one's worst enemy from external enemy, but then there is a way to avoid that, or maybe turn it into one's friends with the help of some of his friends, and so on. But the inner enemy, which is the afflicted emotions, there is no way that you can befriend. You can befriend with your afflicted emotions. So, even if you look at the anger, there is no way that it will become better once you befriend with him. So when someone is angry, he becomes a little bit stronger or more coarse of voice or kind of energetic. So due to the rise of anger within that person. But this will whether help him or bring more harm is not certain. So even though I used to describe the energy that is arising out of when someone is in anger as a blind energy, as it can lead us to any wrong activities. So if we contemplate all these reasons one by one, then it will be very helpful for us. So generally for the external enemy, we normally become very fearful of those enemies, and we also label them as our enemy who bring some harm to us. But then the inner afflicted emotion is the main enemy, which bring us the constant harm and so on. So for the next verses, there is not much to comment. So it's already 11:30, time for lunch. So when you are very hungry, so if you do not get food at that time, you will get angry. In Tibetan, we used to say that when someone gets angry out of hungry, then we have a special term for that. Anger out of hunger.